Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Grung. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and along with Aspat Vedrosyan in this Conversations on Grung episode, we'll be talking about Armenia's southern neighbor Iran and its foreign relations and upcoming elections. This episode was recorded on Friday, May 28, 2021. Originally recorded in Armenian, this conversation has been translated to English by Martin Adamian. Our sincere thanks to him. The South Caucasus comprises Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. The three regional powers surrounding them are Russia to the north, Turkey to the west, and Iran to the south. Iran has largely been quiet about events on its northern border with Armenia and Azerbaijan, due largely to its marginalization on the world stage because of Western economic sanctions, but also because Iran is home to millions of ethnic Azeris, and any perceived support for Armenia could result in additional political instability at home. Yet Iran is also hugely influential, and Armenian-Iranian relations have been largely positive in the modern times, especially in the post-Soviet era. So how should we view our relations with Iran today, and especially in the past year, and what should we expect in the future? To talk about these issues, we are joined by Robert Markarian, who has degrees in physics and law from Tehran University and has published several political articles about Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenian and Persian newspapers and political journals, such as Alik, Iranian Diplomacy, IRAS, the Institute of Iran-Eurasia Studies, IPSC, International Peace Studies Center, and the California Courier. Hello and welcome, Robert.
Ողջույն.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you to you as well. Let's start this discussion by reviewing Iran's historic relations with Armenia since independence.
Thank you. So, Iran-Armenia relations is a very extensive subject. We could talk for hours about its different aspects. But if I were to limit it to a few minutes and present everything that has happened in broad strokes, the foundation of the two countries' relations was placed in the post-independence period. Of course, our relations have thousands of years of history, but we're talking about the most recent period, naturally, after Armenia's independence. In February 1992, diplomatic relations were established with the signing of a treaty and the opening of the Armenian embassy in Iran. I had the honor of seeing the Armenian flag raised for the first time in Tehran at the Armenian embassy. I was there as a young journalist at the time. So next year will be the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two countries. During this time, the two countries' relations have developed normally, we can say. There haven't really been ups and downs like there might be with other countries' relations. But I want to focus on two important aspects of the countries' relations. One is economic commercial relations, and the other is diplomatic and political relations. Economic commercial relations basically started from zero. Both of them started from zero. But they both started to develop in a straight line, we can say, and reached a peak, and have stayed there without any dramatic ups and downs. In the case of political relations, there have sometimes been some problems, especially in the last 3 years after the change of government in Armenia. A change in the two countries' political relations is noticeable. First, let me briefly talk about the economic commercial sphere, then we'll move on to political relations. The data that I have mainly starts from 1995. We started with $124 million turnover in trade, and by 2008 that had to become $363 million. Then it went up a bit to $380 million, but in recent years the turnover has stood at around $350 million. This included exports from Iran to Armenia and vice versa. During this time, Armenia's trade balance has always been negative, meaning the total trade turnover has been in Iran's favor, and Iran's share of that trade turnover has been about 80%, sometimes maybe more, which is natural considering that Armenia has a market of about 2.5 million people and Iran has a market of 80 million people. Also considering Iran's industrial capacity and Armenia's industrial capacity, I think that that's a natural phenomenon. Recently, there's a lot of talk about increasing the size of that trade turnover to the billions. I think those numbers are a bit fantastical. In the best case scenario, it may be possible to increase it to $500 million, and there are certain reasons and limitations for that. Some of these have to do with us and others are out of our control. Let's say in recent years, the sanctions on Iran have been in fact impactful by some percentage. The limitations on the banking sphere have had an impact. The size of the markets are also important. At the end of the day, in Armenia's case, we're talking about a 2.5 million person market, which doesn't have much greater capabilities than that. And in the case of exports from Iran to Armenia, if you look at the export list, alcoholic beverages are in second place, and tobacco. In the case of alcoholic drinks, there's no possibility of exporting from Armenia to Iran. That's already a big obstacle that doesn't allow that key product that we have in Armenia to play any big role in trade. One important detail when we are talking about $360 million in trade, 60% of that is through the Gas for Electricity Treaty, which was established in 2007, if I'm not mistaken, during Robert Markarian's presidency. So if that treaty didn't exist, we'd have about $100 million trade turnover if we take out the Gas for Electricity agreement.
Interesting. Since you mentioned the 500 million threshold, do you think this number may change if Iran one day becomes a member of the Eurasian Economic Union?
Naturally, it would affect it, and when we talk about $500 million in trade, I think people are mainly placing their hope there. We'll have to see. It's hard to talk about precise numbers. Generally, we're talking about potential, that there's a potential to broaden the trade, but we'll have to see what kind of agreements happen. Right now, I think it's too early to talk about what would happen as a result of that. Now, I'd like to continue on to the political sphere. I just briefly spoke about the economic sphere. We haven't had any political problems with Iran. Iran and Armenia have been extremely close friends. There have been friendly relations. There were no incidents between the two countries before the change of government in 2018, and relations went smoothly. After the change of government in 2018, at least by my observations from outside, I have the impression that relations are not at the same level of trust as they were before. You all know that Armenia's foreign policy was the complementary foreign policy, which had as its base mutual trust and respecting each other's interests, respect towards each other's positions and interests. This principle developed during Robert Markarian's time. After that came establishing normal relations with both the West and Iran, and various joint projects were realized. That policy was continued the same way in Serge Sargsyan's time, but after the change of government, that complementary policy, although Nikol Pashinyan frequently said that there would be no changes in foreign policy, in reality we saw something different. I once put it this way, that our complementary foreign policy has been replaced by a sort of pendulum-like policy. Like a pendulum, we were shifting between two poles and going to extremes instead of having balanced relations, which is very dangerous. And it creates a serious problem for our neighbors and partners, whether it's the US, the West, or Iran. They start to doubt how sincere we are in our relations. Of course, to a certain extent, this is somewhat natural because generally after such a change of government, such things happen. When a new government comes to power under abnormal conditions, you have the issue of presenting yourself and proving yourself to the international community and your neighbors and partners, and Nikol Pashinyan himself had that issue. And his method was to curry the West's favor a bit, then flatter Iran a bit, but over time they began to understand that it wasn't sincere. Armenia gave a platform to John Bolton, who made anti-Iran statements in Armenia and talked about tightening the ring around Iran in Armenia. And then we see at the same time Armenia enters another field and starts to collaborate with and flatter Iran. There's one example where some Armenian companies started to negotiate with an Iranian company that since 2003 has been in the petrochemical industry and was targeted by sanctions. I want to point out the kind of extremes that we're talking about. As a result of those extremes, the trust that should have existed in the two countries' relations is now absent. And that trust and feeling of sincerity between the two countries, unfortunately, no longer exists. After the war, I think that the lack of trust has become even worse, especially regarding the Iranian government's attitude towards the Armenian government. I would say that Iran did everything to bring Nikol Pashinyan to their side and keep him among their partners. After the 2018 change of government, after the parliamentary elections in December 2018, when a new government was formed by the elections, the government established its legitimacy. The first country to send an official invitation to Nikol Pashinyan was Iran, and Iran received Nikol Pashinyan at the highest level imaginable, and I think that was a clear message to him that Iran is ready to accept him as a good partner, if he is also sincere towards them. Unfortunately, I think an appropriate response from Armenia to Iran was not made, and for the next year it was done deliberately so that relations with Iran reached a place where last year around September, which was the peak, if you remember, when the issue of opening an embassy in Israel emerged, which became a serious problem in the two countries' relations. I'd also like to note that Armenia and Israel have had diplomatic relations since 1994. Iran did not oppose those relations at any point. As an independent sovereign country, Armenia naturally has the right to have international relations with any country, and Iran did not show any sensitivity to those diplomatic relations. Even after the change of government, Armen Sarkisyan, president of Armenia, visited Israel, where he had several meetings. Again, there was no negative response from Iran. But when the question of opening an embassy was opened, the issue started to change a bit since it became clear for them that this was something in a different category already. And interestingly, for the first time, we saw Armenia's ambassador summoned to Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was something unprecedented in the 28-year history of the two countries' relations. There were two protests organized in front of the Armenian embassy in Iran, which was also unprecedented. Those who know Iran well know that these kinds of protests are not organized coincidentally. No one can gather a few people in the morning and decide to have a protest in front of an embassy. That is impossible. If there's a protest, then it receives special permission. So these were all very direct negative signals from Iran.
Robert, what was the difference between 2019 and 1994? What instigated Iran to action now?
You know, it's because they felt that something has changed in the relations between these two countries. They felt that it was not just about opening an embassy. They felt that it was about hindering Iran in a number of directions. It was sort of like throwing the gauntlet towards Iran in that region. And I think that this directly had to do with the coming Second Artsakh War, which we saw. If you remember, around September 1st, the embassy building opened, and on September 27th, the war started. I think certain circles in Armenia deliberately made it so that an anti-Armenian atmosphere would develop in Iran, so that any kind of assistance from Iran is ruled out in the coming war. That's how I explain it. If need be, I can provide evidence. You know, Iran has always been very sensitive on the Artsakh issue. This is nothing secret. Everyone already knows that during the first Artsakh war, Iran played its part in the war for its own interests. I had discussions with diplomatic circles in that time. They would tell me jokingly that we opened a road for you and helped you liberate those southern regions of Artsakh, where the Artsakh-Iran border is located, until a certain point. But at some point, we felt that you might go on until Baku, and that wasn't convenient for us. One of their ambassadors told me this. We stopped you somewhere because we also had a need for that little border with Azerbaijan. So they wished for those territories to remain under Armenian control for very definite reasons. And they tried to do everything to keep it that way, but it didn't work. And now lately, the distrust towards Armenia's government in Iran comes directly from that issue as well. As a result of the last war, our border with Azerbaijan has multiplied by 3 times. Interestingly, the same thing has happened with Iran. By the way, in our case, it happened because of Nikol Pashinyan, so we are responsible in some way because we lost the war, our border became 3 times longer. In Iran's case, without being at fault for the situation, as a result of Nikol Pashinyan's defeat, it now has a 3 times longer border with Azerbaijan, which is a really serious problem right now for Iran. Iran feels its national security is threatened from those territories, and that is what explains Iran's recent behavior, especially during the Artsakh war. I want to note another important point. I lived in Iran for 45 years. I know those people with every cell of my body, and I've interacted with their diplomatic circles, and I know their attitude towards that question well. You know, when Nikol Pashinyan visited Iran, he attended a community meeting there, and behind him was a giant poster that said, Artsakh is Armenia, full stop. At that time, Iran's government was harshly criticized by the country's pan-Turkish circles. At the time, Nikol Pashinyan's approach to the Artsakh conflict was already being discussed. I'd say that such a poster wasn't there by coincidence. In Iran, anyone who organizes that kind of meeting first has to have the foreign affairs and security officials come over and check those posters and their content one by one. And without their knowledge and permission, no poster could have been placed there. If that poster was put up behind Nikol Pashinyan's head, I think that that was a sort of message from the Iranian authorities that they see Artsakh as attached to Armenia and as a component of Armenia, and don't envision that the liberated territories, especially those on the border with Iran, might one day come under Azerbaijan's control. I've also heard people say jokingly that one time the Iranians told the Armenians that if you ever decide to return those liberated territories to Azerbaijan by some agreement, tell us a few days in advance so we know how to get our things in order over there. I think that says it all.
Thank you. That's an interesting perspective. But let's return to the post-war situation today. Iran had previously announced that it would not tolerate any changes to the Iran-Armenia border and has labeled any international process to jeopardize that border as a red line in its foreign policy. At the same time, since the 44-day war, we've also seen various statements from Iranian politicians congratulating Azerbaijan on the quote-unquote liberation of its territories. Of course, we understand that Iran has quite a large population of ethnic Azeris in its north, but what, in your opinion, are Iran's major goals in its relations with its neighbors in the north?
Just a bit ago, I explained that for 27 years, Iran had a border with Artsakh, where it didn't have any problems or any worries about what's going on the other side of the border. They were completely confident that there were no threats to them from those territories, from its common border with Artsakh. Now the Azerbaijanis have established themselves in those territories, and the complete opposite situation exists there. Iran doesn't know what's going on there. Iran definitely has a strong desire to have some sort of presence in those territories, since it senses serious threats from there. Remember that in recent years, various terrorist attacks have been carried out by Israel against Iran by Israel, targeting nuclear facilities, and Azerbaijan has played a direct role in some of those terrorist attacks, as in Azerbaijan's border played a direct role in those attacks. So there's a big threat to Iran from that border. Now that border has become 3 times longer, and Iran doesn't know what's going on the other side. That's how I would explain Iran's current attitude, that they want to extend a hand of friendship to Azerbaijan in every way, maybe being obsequious towards them a little, so that they can secure a presence in those territories for themselves. That is their goal, to be in those territories in the form of some projects, for example, reconstruction, because they're very suspicious about who's coming there. There's already talk about European countries and European companies expressing their wish to come and work in the territories adjacent to Iran. Israeli companies have expressed their desire to come there and work on reconstruction in those territories, which is very worrying for Iran. I think that Iran is trying to convince Azerbaijan in every way to also have them in mind in those reconstruction projects so that they can have some sort of presence there. Iran's efforts with Armenia are also the same. They want any projects that occur around Mehri and near the border to be under their control and with their knowledge and participation, so that they can exercise serious control. You know, there's this sensitive issue. Before the 44-day war, the connection between Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan was realized exclusively via Iran's territory. So Iran had complete control over the connection between Nakhichevan and Azerbaijan. The route passed through Iran, and all the transportation of goods and people happened over Iran's territory. The gas that Azerbaijan provided to Nakhichevan passed through Iran as well. Now, with these new projects, Iran is losing its oversight, and they have serious concerns about what is going to be happening in the areas near its border. And they want to have a presence at every cost, so that they can exercise control, if need be, over those routes and projects.
Robert, last week, Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif visited Yerevan and Baku. What were the major goals of this visit? Are there any results that we can talk about today?
The visit was unplanned, and its content was very basic. I explained in another interview why I consider this an unplanned visit based on the needs of the day. Generally, when any official from one country goes to another country, he is first greeted by his counterpart from that country, and the visit is planned so that he first meets with his counterpart and discusses things with him, and then has meetings at other levels. When Zarif went to Baku, Ceyhun Bayramov was already on the way to Vienna, as in he wasn't greeted by his counterpart and didn't meet with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but only met Aliyev. So this visit was organized so hastily that they hadn't even thought to hold it one day later, so that Bayramov would have returned from his meeting related to the OSCE Minsk group in Vienna. If you remember the day before, that the Armenian press spread some interesting news. First, they said that 10 Iranian generals had come to Yerevan. Then they said that Nikol Pashinyan had rejected their proposal for support. Then immediately after, it was said that there are 160 Armenian prisoners of war in Iran, and Iran had set some conditions for their return, which was immediately and sharply denied by official sources in Iran. Then immediately after that, Zarif decided to quickly visit the region. It was necessary for him to first go to Baku and learn about the problems in the border regions of Syunik and Gegarkunik from Aliyev and the Azerbaijani side, then go to Armenia, perhaps knowing about what kind of agreements exist and see how these problems might be solved and what kind of role Iran can play in this issue. Interestingly, in the text of the meeting between Aliyev and Zarif, of course, this is just the introductory part. We don't know the full content of the meeting. There's nothing about respecting each other's borders and territorial integrity. There are repeated references to Aliyev's historical role to make peace in the region. On the contrary, in Armenia, Zarif very clearly raised the issue of preserving territorial integrity and borders. I felt that the Iranian side blames the Armenian government, and particularly Nikol Pashinyan, on that issue, since they bring up that issue while at the table with Pashinyan and not with Aliyev. That's how I would explain what I've read and what's been published. Naturally, we don't know about what's being discussed behind closed doors.
Since you mentioned it, the news about Iranian generals and Armenian POWs in Iran, is there any truth to those? And if not, then who would benefit from spreading such news?
In the case of the generals, it's possible that it happened. After all, the two countries are neighbors. It's very normal for some high-ranking soldiers to go to Armenia. That they made a proposal for assistance is also normal. Of course, it seems a little strange because at the end of the day, Armenia is in Russia's sphere of influence, and Russia's border guards are stationed there and supervise the Armenia-Iran border. It's a little strange. If they talked about military assistance, what exactly did they have in mind? Of course, Iran can't station border guards there on the other side of the border. That's completely ruled out. As for the 160 prisoners, I have doubts about that number. 160 is quite big, almost as much as the number of prisoners we have in Azerbaijan. I think that's a strange number. It's possible that there were a few border violations during the war. That's quite normal, because during the war, there was fighting along a several hundred-kilometer border. It's possible that our soldiers were encircled, and the only way out was to cross the border, and after crossing, of course, the border guards arrested them, which is to be expected if you're crossing into another country while armed. It's not like crossing from one backyard into another. You're crossing a state border, and there are laws about that, naturally, and there will be procedures. It's interesting to me that the news spread so much. The news reached the Armenian press through some unknown sources. I think that the same sources that right before the war in September tried to use the opening of the embassy in Israel to ruin Armenian-Iranian relations and create an anti-Armenian atmosphere in Iran are now working in the opposite direction to create an anti-Iranian atmosphere by spreading to create the impression that Iran is holding Armenian prisoners and placing conditions on their release just like Azerbaijan. So there was an attempt to create such an atmosphere that luckily didn't work, with the purpose of placing Iran under pressure. I think. Iran is very clearly against the realization of new projects in the region if they are not participating in them, especially regarding the cession of lands in Meghri. Iran is absolutely opposed to that. And I think that this was an attempt to put Iran under pressure, not very well thought out, and Zarif's visit to Armenia was the response. I recommend that you and your listeners visit the Armenian Prime Minister's website and watch the video of Mr. Zarif and Nikol Pashinyan's meeting posted there. You can already tell from their faces what kind of conversation they're having with what purposes. You can see a completely different Zarif there, and Nikol Pashinyan seems a bit different there as well. You can see that the atmosphere is not normal. I think that Iran very clearly told Armenia its problems with the opening of the corridor. The corridor issue was definitely discussed. I think that Zarif learned about the agreements during his meeting with Aliyev. If there's any secret Pashinyan-Aliyev agreement, then he learned about it. And Iran's future steps are conditioned by that fact. There was also a very important statement made by Iran during that visit. Iran at once brought up the issue of the Meghri Free Economic Zone, which was forgotten for a long time and nobody talked about it. It was opened in December 2017 when Karin Karapetyan was Prime Minister. Iran clearly talked about activating the Meghri Free Economic Zone and then about the railroad through Nakhichevan, through which Iranian Julfa might be connected with Yerevan and then maybe to Tbilisi. I think that Iran is sending a message that these two routes are equally important to them. So the land route with Armenia is important and has to be preserved at all costs. And if there can be a rail link too, even better. They're not going to abandon the land connection with Armenia in exchange for some rail links that the acting Prime Minister of Armenia frequently talks about.
Robert, Iran recently signed a huge deal with China where the latter has committed to invest over $400 billion in Iran over the next 25 years in exchange for a steady supply of oil. The deal includes military cooperation, which is a departure from previous Chinese involvement in the Middle East, which was mostly limited to economics. How will this deal shift Iran's foreign policy, and not just vis-a-vis Armenia, but also all of its northern neighbors, their Middle East policies, OPEC, the West, etc.?
Especially about the neighbors in the north.
Let me speak briefly about that treaty. I often see that Iran-China treaty discussed in Armenia. What's been published is a 4-page short description. Nobody knows yet about the details of the treaty. All the information we have is from that 4-page introduction, which mainly contains the two countries' wishes about cooperation in various spheres. Some circles in Iran have a very negative opinion about that treaty, considering it a colonial and humiliating treaty for Iran. It might surprise you how Iranian internal circles approach that treaty. Many of them consider it a trap for Iran, to steep the country in debt. They call it a debt trap, to put Iran in debt where they will not be able to pay and will be forced to provide land to China. They bring Sri Lanka as an example, where, if I'm not mistaken, a similar treaty was signed with China in 2017, receiving $361 million in investments. Sri Lanka got investments from the China Exim Bank to carry out projects in one of its ports. Then it was unable to pay the debt and rented out the port to China for 99 years. And everyone in Iran is now saying that this deal comes with similar dangers for Iran, especially considering that in the last 2 years, Iran's external debt has reached $290 billion. And everyone is saying that Iran doesn't have the ability right now to pay off the $400 million investment that you just mentioned. In reality, Iran is agreeing to sell its oil to China in exchange for that investment. And if they can't pay off those debts in the future, they're going to have serious problems. China already has a big economic presence in Iran that is negatively perceived. In the Persian Gulf to Iran's south, Chinese fishing boats are already present at the ports and carry out large-scale fishing and cause serious problems for Iranian fishers, because they can't work and make their living in those areas anymore. Or Chinese companies involved in Bitcoin mining are in Iran, since in Iran, electricity is extremely cheap. They're making a big profit, and as a result of that nowadays, there are power outages in Iran. So there are serious problems. I want to say that everything is not so positive. But nevertheless, looking from the outside, that treaty is important, especially regarding the idea of reopening the Silk Road. China naturally is trying to bring Iran into its sphere of influence and through Iran gain access to Russia and Europe. That's the major Silk Road project. In this direction, we, Armenia, can have great opportunities. But what's important is that we are able to prove ourselves, as in explain where we stand in this whole project, what role we can play. We need a strong group of negotiators who can discuss things with our partners and present our demands and take its share of these projects. We don't want to be in the role of just presenting what we can give to others, but also have our own interests, so others don't just use us and our interests are forgotten. A strong government and strong diplomacy and strong foreign policy is needed for this, which unfortunately I consider impossible under the present government. If this government is going to continue with this style of work, I can hardly see us benefiting from this treaty or other regional projects in general. We'll just end up as a means for others to benefit, and we won't be able to get anything out of it for ourselves.
Robert, at the same time, there have been some signs that Russia's and Iran's vision of cooperation with the West may not be fully in sync. One instance of this became evident when an interview with Javad Zarif was leaked prematurely, where he seemed to say that hardliners in Iran, backed by Russia, were working to prevent Iran's nuclear deal with the West. In your opinion, how will these geopolitical developments progress in the future? Is the divergence in the relationship between Russia and Iran related to the China deal? And what opportunities and challenges does this present for Armenia?
It's very natural. At the end of the day, Iran and Russia are two regional superpowers. Putting aside the problems with Iran's government or what kind of internal problems there are in Iran, if you look on the international sphere from outside, Iran has its say in the region as a regional power. It has its sphere of influence in different parts of the Middle East. Naturally, in those regions, in Syria in particular, it's considered one of Russia's competitors. On many issues in Syria, they are competitors. Right now, through a lot of projects in the gas and oil sphere in Syria, has come under Russia's monopolistic influence, and Iran has no opportunity to carry out any kind of activity there. Naturally, every country acts according to its interests. In the case of the nuclear agreement, it's understandable that Russia was opposed and was trying to disrupt it, since close ties were going to be established between Iran and the West through that agreement. Before that, Russia was Iran's only reliable partner. But if that nuclear deal was realized, Russia's role in Iran would start to decline, and Iran was going to gain partners in the West, in Europe and America. It's understandable that Russia tried in every way to disrupt this process, so that it would have a decisive role and remain Iran's sole partner and dictate its policies to Iran that way in different areas. That's how I would explain the conservatives in Iran trying to prevent the nuclear deal, with Russia's help. Naturally, Russia was pursuing its interests and the conservatives theirs, since it wasn't in their interest for the reformist government in Iran to make some deal with the United States. They think that way now too, that if any agreement is to be made with the West, that it has to happen under the conservatives, and they have to get the credit for it, not the reformists. And that interview was interesting. Its leaking was directly involved with the pre-election period in Iran. It wasn't supposed to be published at all. The purpose of that was to discredit Mr. Zarif among the public and close his route to the candidacy. Mr. Zarif was one of the potential candidates for president from the reformists. He could have been very successful and received many votes, since he's a very skilled diplomat. He was educated in the West and exceeded everybody with his education and experience, and was also popular with Iran's public. But after that recording was leaked, Zarif's name was removed from the list of potential candidates, and the conservatives achieved their goal in a way.
All right, let's discuss the elections. So in a few days before the scheduled elections in Armenia, there will also be elections in Iran. Can you describe the major political camps that are vying for power, and what will be the major theme in these elections?
As you know, at the moment, there are 7 candidates for president of Iran. Out of them, we can say with 100% certainty that Iran's next president will be Ebrahim Raisi. No one has any doubts about it right now. This is the second non-competitive election in the last 40 years of Iran's history. The last one was in 1981, Iran's third presidential elections, when, interestingly enough, Mr. Khamenei was elected president. At the time, there were 3 candidates, and 2 of the candidates declared on television that no one should vote for them, and everybody should vote for Khamenei, and Mr. Khamenei won with 17 million votes and became Iran's 3rd president, paving the way for him to become supreme leader. Now, 40 years later, we're in the same exact situation. Now Mr. Khamenei is supreme leader, and again there's a non-competitive election, the results of which are already clear. Now, naturally, participation is going to be very low in this election. State circles know this too, and there's talk that voter turnout is not that important. Mr. Raisi was also a candidate in the last election and received 16 million votes, but didn't win. Now an attempt is being made to make sure that he gets some 20 million votes, so that he gets more votes than he did last time and is elected, or rather appointed president of Iran.
Do you think these elections can have foreign policy implications?
There will not be changes in Iran's foreign policy. Iran's politics are mainly decided by the supreme leader. The president has limited powers. Main policy is also set by a body called the Expediency Discernment Council, which we can consider like a Senate. Its members are appointed by the supreme leader. But again, the decisions have to be approved by the supreme leader, who has veto power over practically any decision. In other words, foreign policy is decided elsewhere. And whoever the president may be, he carries out the same foreign policy. Not much is going to change. All of these processes really have to do with the issue of electing Mr. Raisi as the next supreme leader of Iran. The current supreme leader is already 82 years old. He has serious health problems and is suffering from cancer, according to some sources, and it seems the doctors have said that he doesn't have long to live. And they've been discussing for years already who is going to succeed him. And this is discussed very seriously in Iranian circles because it's a serious issue and they don't want to end up in a situation where the leader will unexpectedly die and the office will remain unoccupied. So they already want to select and prepare someone for that role. Mr. Raisi being brought to prominence is being discussed in that context. Throughout the years, 3 main names were discussed as potential successors. All 3 of them, by the way, have been head of Iran's judicial system. The first is Ayatollah Hashemi Shahrudi, who died 3 years ago. After him came Sadek Amoli Larijani. He was also presented as a potential successor. But then suddenly some corruption cases were opened against people close to him, and he resigned and left the post of Chief Justice. And third, Ibrahim Raisi, who's the youngest to be discussed as the next supreme leader. And now he is Chief Justice of Iran and is preparing to move from the judicial to the executive branch and become the country's leader. I'll say very briefly, there are 2 main, completely different views about Ibrahim Raisi becoming president. Some people say that this is preparing the ground for Mr. Raisi to become supreme leader 1 or 2 years later as a younger figure to come and replace the supreme leader. Others think that this is an attempt to prevent his pretensions to become supreme leader by bringing him into the executive branch. And the candidate for the next leader is the supreme leader's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, who has remained in the background in recent years, and now everybody believes that he has a decisive role in running the country, and he has a presence everywhere, and in the background, he's helping his father and preparing to succeed him as leader. For me, it will probably be clear in a year what's happening, but nevertheless, we can say now that Iran's president will be Ibrahim Raisi, and the elections will be non-competitive. As for Armenia-Iran relations, I don't think we will see any changes due to the presidential elections. Whether it's the conservatives or reformists, Iran's foreign policy is the same. And it's us, with our behavior and approach, who can make them understand our role in Iran's foreign policy and dictate to Iran how they should deal with us in their foreign policy.
We discussed that there were hundreds of candidates that were not approved for the elections. Can you tell us what criteria does the Guardian Council use to approve or reject a particular candidate?
You know, the Guardian's Council is not required by law to publicize on what basis it makes its decisions, so no one can say for sure why any one candidate was not approved. The Guardian Council uses this phrasing. They don't say that they've rejected this one person's worthiness for some reason. They say, we are convinced that he does not fulfill the requirements to be Iran's president. It seems funny, of course, considering that Mr. Larijani had his candidacy approved in one previous election. For a long time, he was president of the Islamic Assembly of Iran, and now his candidacy is rejected immediately. Everyone knows that it's a matter of removing candidates from the contest, and obviously create such an atmosphere where the candidate approved by the Supreme Leader and the Conservatives is elected. And so that if there are any nuclear deal negotiations, they continue under the Conservatives. And if there's any agreement with the West or the US, the credit for that will go completely to the Conservatives, and they will come out as the winning side, so that they can say, see, we came and effectively negotiated the agreement and solved all our problems, and Rouhani didn't succeed in running the country. He signed the nuclear deal, but after Trump came to power, it all collapsed, and he was unable to achieve a positive result. But the Conservatives are trying to come and take all the credit for themselves and finish off this issue, especially since now the Democrats are in power, and it will probably be easier to make a deal with them than with Trump.
Such was the conversation on Grung today. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you to our guest, Mr. Markarian. Talk to you next week. That concludes this week's conversation on Grung. We look forward to your feedback, including your suggestions for conversation topics in the future. Contact us on our website at groong.org, that's Groong, or on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Lara Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm Hovik Manucharian, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you soon.